It began like any other day until everything suddenly changed. A black woman walked into a courthouse in New York City, calm and composed, unaware that she was about to be mistreated by those responsible for upholding the law. They treated her as if she didn't matter at all, humiliating her, violating her, and even laughing as they did it. But what they didn't know was that they had just crossed the wrong person, because she was not just any citizen. She was the one person with the legal power to hold them accountable. What followed was a storm of justice, revelations, and a courtroom twist that turned everything upside down. Stay tuned, because you have no idea what's coming next. And feel free to drop a comment about where you're watching from and what time it is. Shortly after 8 in the morning, Celeste Brown pulled up in her silver sedan and stepped onto the stone steps of the New York Federal Courthouse. The sun was slowly rising behind old ivy-covered trees, casting long shadows on the steps. She adjusted the collar of her navy blazer, squared her shoulders, and clutched an elegant leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels clicked softly on the pavement. Every step seemed to silently announce her determination. Celeste never wore her robe outside the courtroom. She preferred to enter buildings like any regular citizen, quiet, composed, and observant. However, that day, no one recognized her as a judge. Instead, to many, she was just another black woman walking into a place where power had never been easy to earn. At the security checkpoint, the atmosphere shifted immediately as she approached. Security guard Mike Johnson, known for his strict, old-fashioned manner, narrowed his eyes when he saw her pass through the metal detectors. He didn't recognize her, and worse, he didn't care to. With his arms crossed, he raised his gloved hand and barked, "Ma'am, I need you to step aside." Celeste paused for a brief moment. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked. Mike's eyes swept over every detail, from her neatly styled silver hair to her pressed trousers and the calm but confident look in her eyes. Something about her bothered him. She seemed to belong there, and in his view, people like her needed a reminder of who was really in charge. "No ID visible. You don't just stroll into a federal building like that," he muttered. Calmly, Celeste produced her government-issued credentials, which glinted in the light, but Mike didn't even take the time to look at them properly. He snatched them from her hand, gave a cursory glance, then stuffed them in his pocket. She raised an eyebrow and asked for them back. He stepped closer and added, "You're in a hurry, aren't you?" A young female staffer standing by the X-ray machine watched nervously but said nothing. "I need to get to the courtroom," Celeste said firmly. "Then you'll have to follow our procedures," snapped Mike in a rough tone, "and that includes random checks. Let's go." Without giving her a chance to respond, he placed a heavy hand on her upper arm and steered her down a side corridor, away from the hustle and bustle, into a windowless screening room just beyond the security area. Inside, the air was cool and still. In the center of the room stood a metal chair, accompanied by a rolling cart of scanning equipment, and resting on the edge of a table was a pair of clippers. Celeste's heart skipped a beat. "I do not consent to this," she declared clearly. "You have no legal basis to detain me. Your actions are suspicious," he retorted, motioning toward the chair. "Have a seat." But she did not move. Leaning in close, Mike said in a low tone, "You think that badge you flashed means something here? Not for me." In an instant, 2 more officers entered the room. One of them, a man with a shaved head and anxious eyes, grabbed her left wrist while another positioned himself beside the chair. Celeste's voice rose as she cried, "This is a violation. I want your names." Yet no one answered. Instead, Mike reached for the clippers. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "It's just the standard procedure. Maybe you're hiding something in that hair," he explained with a dismissive gesture toward her locks. Celeste tried to rise, but a firm grip forced her back down. The clippers began to buzz, filling the room with a sound like a swarm of bees. Before she could react, she felt the cold vibration on her scalp as thick strands of silver hair fell to the floor one by one, as if her past were being brutally torn away. She held her breath. She didn't scream, cry, or even blink. She sat there as her dignity was stripped away, hair by hair, collecting in small heaps on the tiled floor like fragments of a broken history. A nearby guard snickered quietly. "Looks like it suits you better now," he muttered. Mike, wiping some loose hairs from his sleeve, added mockingly, "You should have come in with some respect. Now you're more presentable." Celeste's fists clenched on her lap, but when her voice returned, it was steady. "You will regret this." Mike leaned in with a sneer. "People like you always say that." And just as quickly as it began, it was over. Mike opened the door and signaled for her to head down the hall. "You're free to go. Courtroom is that way," he said mockingly. Celeste slowly rose, her hands trembling slightly. She retrieved her credential from Mike's desk without asking and walked into the corridor. Her steps were measured, her expression unreadable, but inside, something burned hotter than anger, deeper than humiliation. It was pure determination. In just a few minutes, that determination would change everything, because Mike had no idea that she wasn't there to be observed as a defendant, but to take her rightful seat on the bench. The buzzing of the clippers followed her out of that cold, windowless room. Every step toward the courtroom grew heavier, not from fear, but from contained fury. Her scalp stung, where her once proud silver hair had grown, now reduced to a chaotic mess that bore witness to years of struggle, family history, and identity that had been brutally torn apart. The corridor was thick with suffocating silence. Celeste passed by two employees who glanced at her briefly before looking away. They had heard, maybe even seen, but no one dared speak up. She kept walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. From the double doors of the courtroom came a low murmur. It was a high-profile morning, a hearing on police misconduct. Several officers involved in a brutal incident during a protest the previous year were now under intense media scrutiny, and reporters crowded the area. Celeste was scheduled to enter through a private entrance where her robe awaited, and the staff had been prepped to maintain decorum. But that day, none of that mattered. She paused at the doorway, took a deep breath, and pushed the doors open firmly. Instantly, the room fell silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes turned and everyone realized the woman they had seen, escorted like a suspect, whose head bore the marks of brutality, was not a victim of circumstance. She was the judge. Celeste strode into the courtroom and slowly turned to face the assembled crowd. Her face was composed and cool, a type of calm not born from comfort but from precision. Someone near the defense table accidentally dropped a pen. The same guard who had wielded the clippers still stood by the door. When their eyes met, the man froze. He opened his mouth slightly, but no words emerged, and his face lost all color. Without hesitation, Celeste picked up her robe, neatly folded on the chair, and put it on herself with slow, measured movements. The garment settled on her shoulders like armor. She then turned to the court clerk and asked in an even tone, "Is the docket ready?" The clerk stuttered. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste nodded and lowered herself into her chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her. She looked straight ahead, deliberately avoiding the man who had humiliated her, at least for the moment. "Today, we will begin the preliminary testimony in case 2361 against the New York Police Department," she announced, as if nothing had happened. "The charges include abuse of power, excessive force, and violations of civil rights." A murmur of "Yes, Your Honor" spread through the room. The attorneys shifted in their seats, some with eyes wide open, others appearing guilty, while A few seemed angry, as if they couldn't believe a black woman was daring to walk in after everything they assumed had broken her. She ignored them all and continued, "Let's proceed." The first witness was called, a police officer who had been on duty during the protest, a man who had pushed an elderly man during a peaceful demonstration, breaking 2 of his ribs. Celeste listened attentively, took notes, and did not ask any questions. Not yet. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed that Mike was slowly backing away toward the rear of the room, his hands twitching near his belt and his legs shuffling, as if he wanted to disappear, knowing his moment had come. And indeed, it did. After the second witness, the judge announced a recess. The courtroom emptied as if everyone had slipped into a daze. Even the lawyers whispered, afraid to speak too loudly. Celeste remained seated. A few minutes later, when only the clerk, 2 officers, and Mike were left, she looked squarely at him and said in a voice as sharp as glass, "Officer Mike." He halted mid-step, made an uncertain move forward and stammered, Yes, Your Honor." She motioned for him to come closer. "Please state your full name for the record." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. My name is Mike Johnson. How long have you worked at this courthouse?" "From 14 years, he replied. Celeste tapped her pen on her notepad once, twice, then leaned in and asked, "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in this screening room?" Mike's face turned ashen. "Your Honor, he began, but she interrupted. "I did not know." "That's not what I'm asking." He looked around, searching for support, but no one came forward. "How many formal complaints have been filed against you, officer?" I'm not sure exactly," he answered hesitantly. Celeste spoke with unwavering precision. 12 formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed, because you hid behind procedures and protocol. Her voice grew even sterner. "You thought I was nothing, just another black woman you could bully, shave, and humiliate for fun." A heavy silence fell over the room. Mike tried to speak, but no sound came out. Rising from the bench, Celeste continued, "Because of you, this courthouse, this supposed temple of justice, is now tainted. Your actions have called into question the very integrity of this court, and for assaulting a federal judge in her own courthouse, you are now subject to immediate criminal investigation." She then turned to the officers waiting by the exit. "Escort Officer Mike out of the building immediately. Formal charges will follow." The officers acted quickly, cuffing him. Wait, Mike shouted. "You can't do this." But it was too late. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of justice. Mike Johnson, once a symbol of control and intimidation, was silently escorted out, his authority stripped away, leaving an uneasy stillness echoed in the hum of the ceiling fans and the knowing. Glances exchanged by those who had long kept silent. Celeste Brown returned to her seat, fingers intertwined on the chair's backrest as her robe draped over her like an impenetrable shield. There was no turning back, and frankly she didn't want to, because something had fundamentally changed, not only within her but throughout the room. Her clerk entered quietly and placed a fresh stack of notes on her desk. "Your Honor, the next set of testimonies is ready," the clerk said cautiously. Celeste nodded. "We have about 8 minutes." She glanced out at the waiting area with rows of wooden benches where the jury, journalists, and public would soon return, yet she still sensed Mike's lingering presence, like an oil stain on polished marble. She exhaled deeply. The day had already defied all expectations, and it was only noon. Then she heard the creak of a door behind her. Turning, she saw a young woman in her early 20s, wearing slightly fogged glasses from hurrying through the lobby, enter the room. It was an intern named Jessica, always quiet and reserved, who looked noticeably pale. Celeste gave a slight nod. "Are you okay, Jessica?" she asked. The young woman hesitated, closed the door, and approached softly, whispering, "I just wanted to say that I saw what happened today with Officer Mike outside the screening room. I didn't know what to do. I should have spoken up, but I was so scared." Celeste studied the trembling hands of Jessica for a moment before replying gently, "Thank you for telling me. That means a lot." "I couldn't stop it," Jessica added. "But if you need me to testify, I'm ready." Celeste extended her hand across the desk, offering a silent gesture of comfort and warmth. Shortly thereafter, the doors opened again with a more solemn air, signaling the public's return. "Everyone, please rise," the clerk announced in a steady voice. Immediately, everyone stood, even those who had earlier laughed at Mike's remarks behind closed doors. Celeste resumed her seat and declared, "Court is now in session." As the next witness prepared to take the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, yet unmistakably. The balance of power was no longer in question. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was an accounting. The next witness was a father, named Robert Davis, a blue-collar worker with a rugged look, sporting a salt and pepper beard and hands hardened by years of labor. Despite his fatigue, his eyes shone with unwavering determination. He was there to recount how his 17-year-old son had been knocked down and restrained during a peaceful protest by the very same officers now seated at the defense table. One of the officers had slammed his knee into his son's throat. The teenager survived, though he could barely manage to whisper. That incident had taken place about 9 months ago. Robert stepped up to the witness stand and detailed how he and others pleaded for medical assistance, how he was reassured that everything would be fine, how he was accused of faking, and how, when the footage emerged, none of the officers were held accountable. Celeste listened intently, as if every word was a sharp blade cutting through the room's complacency. When Robert finished, she leaned in and said, "Mr. Davis, thank you for your bravery. I know this isn't easy." He nodded, his voice cracking. "I just needed to feel that someone was finally listening to us." Celeste looked at him, not as a judge in the seat, but as someone who had felt the weight of silence firsthand. "You have been heard," she declared firmly. A few minutes later, after Robert left the stand and passed slowly by the officers who had nearly taken his son's life, Celeste called for another recess. In her chambers, the silence was almost tangible. She sat in front of a mirror hanging above a sink, noticing that the thinning patches on her scalp were beginning to fill back in, and the silver hair that once crowned her head was slowly growing. Back, though unevenly. For a moment she wished she could hide the scars, smooth over the areas that still felt exposed. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her sister, Natalie, entered without a word, wheeling a small folding chair up to her desk. She plugged in a compact hair clipper and asked, "Are you ready?" Celeste looked into the mirror, not with fear, but with determination, and whispered, "Yes, let's do this." Studied her reflection long and hard. What she saw was strong, natural, determined, and beautiful. "You could rock that look every single day and own every room you walk into," Natalie said with a grin. Celeste paused, then softly replied, "This is who I am now." "No," corrected Natalie. "You've always been that way. The world is just finally catching up to you." They both smiled. That evening, Celeste left the courthouse without a wig, without a scarf or hat, just her head held high, illuminated by the city lights. On the sidewalk, a small group of passers-by watched her. No cameras, no reporters, just everyday people. An older woman, around 70 years old, with warm skin and thick glasses, approached and gently placed her hand on Celeste's arm, saying, "I never thought I'd see someone like you do what you've just done," her voice trembling. Celeste took her hand and replied, "You have done more than survive. You have paved the way." Later, a shy teenager approached without saying a word, then removed the hood from his sweatshirt to reveal his own shaved head, nodding silently. Celeste returned the nod, and in that quiet exchange, a legacy was passed on. Later that night, Celeste sat on the porch of her apartment, looking out over her peaceful neighborhood. The porch lights flickered softly, and the breeze rustled the tall trees. Her phone buzzed with dozens of texts, emails, and headlines, but she decided to let them wait. That night wasn't about the noise. It was about finally listening to herself breathe. The next morning, she returned to the courthouse. On paper, business proceeded as usual, but people noticed that the robes were taken off more slowly. The steps echoed with newfound respect. And as she entered a routine civil case, the entire courtroom stood up even before the clerk had announced her arrival, something that had never happened before. She nodded and took her seat. Justice, as always, went on. More cases, more motions, more files. But something had fundamentally changed, not in the rules, but in the atmosphere. Justice now had a new face, one that made no apologies for the space it occupied. Celeste walked the corridors with a different confidence, not harsher or louder, but whole, like someone who had been forced to shrink for years and had finally learned what it means to stand tall with pride. The press continued to show up. Interviews were given, and headlines appeared. One of them, taped to the break room refrigerator, read, "Federal judge refuses to back down after public assault. Launches historic reform from the bench." Someone had scribbled below it, "She's our judge," and that brought a smile to her face. She had never set out to become a symbol. She only wanted to do her job. But by standing her ground, she had given others permission to stand up as well. Months passed. The courtroom, which once echoed with fear and silence, now pulsed with a different energy. Not perfect or peaceful, but full of dignity and a quiet assurance that everyone would be heard. The famous Brown Decree spread first through the courthouse and then across the country. Other judges began to adopt it, and even in other cities people were talking about it. Lawmakers in Congress were drafting new legislation. Celeste hadn't planned any of this, but as it turned out, so much of what had happened wasn't planned at all. She simply refused to back down. And that alone was enough to change everything. She continued working tirelessly, presiding over civil disputes, custody cases, and tax hearings. Yet every decision now carried a deeper meaning, a heightened awareness of those whom the system had neglected. One afternoon, Celeste was invited to a local elementary school to speak about justice and courage. She expected a small class and some awkward silences, but the room was packed. The children had followed the trial, read the news, and even made signs. One of them, taped to the chalkboard, read simply, "Be like Judge Brown." She didn't have to speak for long, because the kids asked real questions. How do you stay calm when people hate you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered each question, honestly, but the one posed by a quiet little girl in the corner struck her deeply. "Do you still believe in the system?" Celeste paused and then said softly, "I no longer believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become, and I believe in you, because it's through questions like these that change happens." After leaving the school, tears streamed down her face in the car, not from pain, but from hope. Soon after, the president's office contacted her. Celeste Brown had been chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised, with prepared speeches and distinguished guests, But what mattered most was who would be sitting in the front row. Natalie, her secretary, Jessica, now a first-year law student, Pastor Marcus, and in the very back, the little girl from the school who had asked the crucial question. The stage was set with a grand set of white marble steps leading up to the podium, and the president stood to one side. When Celeste walked onto the stage, applause surged like a wave, but she made no grand gesture. She simply stepped up to the microphone and began, "I was never supposed to be here." The room fell silent. Not because I wasn't qualified or didn't deserve it, but because, for most of my life, systems like this were not built for people like me. Looking out at this audience, I recall being made to feel that I didn't belong. But I stayed, I fought, and I made myself seen. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I survived a moment that should have broken me, and because I know too many who didn't have that chance. This medal is not just mine. It belongs to every woman who was told to stay quiet, every man who was told that justice wasn't for him, every child who looked at the law and saw only fear. This is for you. The applause that followed was not overwhelming, but it was filled with respect, as if people were finally applauding something they truly understood. When the ceremony ended, Celeste stepped off the stage. In a prison in another prominent English-speaking state, Officer Mike Johnson watched the broadcast on a small, wall-mounted television. He didn't blink or move. He just stared at the woman he once tried to break, now honored nationwide for the strength he had attempted to erase. The screen went dark after the credits, yet that silence lingered, not as punishment, but as truth. And truth, it turns out, cannot be silenced. What happened in that courthouse was not just a story about one woman or one building. It was a story of dignity, of truth, and of what happens when we finally say, enough is enough. Judge Celeste Brown didn't merely enforce the law, she drew a line in the sand. She reminded us that justice is not just about punishment, but about accountability, that strength comes from rising after being stripped down, from speaking out when silence is easier, and from leading with integrity, even when the system turns against you. For those of us who have witnessed change and resistance, this story strikes a deep chord because we know that real progress is slow, costly, and demands courage from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, seen a loved one face injustice, or felt utterly powerless in its presence. But this story shows that power doesn't come from a badge, a title, or even a judge's bench. It comes from standing tall when the world wants you to shrink. So, if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so we can continue to tell stories that matter, stories that challenge, inspire, and speak truth out loud. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins with us, together, right now.